In this chapter of movies, we're going to look at the many ways to import music and other content into your iTunes library. So first of all, I've gotten rid of all the songs I imported in the previous chapter when I needed some examples to demonstrate the iTunes interface. So we're going to start with a clean, blank iTunes library in this chapter. Now in the movie following this one, I'm going to talk about importing music from audio CDs. When you import songs from a CD into your library, that song is encoded by iTunes into a file, and that file is stored on your hard drive. The amount of space that file takes up depends on the length of the song and the encoding settings you use when you import it. And the encoding settings you use are going to affect the audio quality of that particular song. Generally, larger files are going to sound better than smaller files. So let's go to iTunes Preferences. If you're on Windows, you'll go to Edit Preferences. And we're going to go to the General category. And we're going to look at the section near the bottom of the window. Now, in the previous chapter, we looked at the menu where you can determine what happens when you insert a CD into your computer, whether you want iTunes to automatically start importing the CD or ask you what to do, and so on. We also have a checkbox here called Automatically Retrieve CD Track Names from the Internet, which is on by default. And that basically means that when you insert an audio CD, iTunes will connect to an online database and try to determine what CD you've just inserted, and then list the track names instead of just giving you a generic list of names like track 01, track 02, and so on. You probably do want to keep this option checked to save yourself the hassle of manually typing track information in each time you import a CD. iTunes won't always recognize every CD, and it still occasionally misidentifies CDs, but it does get it right most of the time, and you can manually make any necessary changes or corrections. But what I really want to talk about here in this movie are the import settings. At the top of this import setting window, you'll find the Import Using menu. And these are the encoding options that are built into iTunes 9, and you'll find the same options on both Mac and Windows. Basically, these encoders are different ways for iTunes to convert music into files to store on your computer. Now, by far the most well-known type of encoder is the MP3 encoder. The term MP3 is pretty much synonymous with digital music, regardless of whether the file is actually an MP3 or not. MP3 was the codec that first made it possible to take a sound file and compress it down to a small transferable size while maintaining decent audio quality. So many people are still encoding music as MP3 these days. But you probably saw that the default encoder in iTunes is the AAC encoder. AAC files generally sound as good or better than MP3 files that are encoded at the same or even higher bitrate. Now when I talk about bitrate, I'm referring to the setting menu here. The default setting for the AAC encoder is iTunes Plus, which you can see down here means it's 128 kilobits per second for mono recordings and 256 kilobits per second for stereo recordings. Most recordings are in stereo these days, so you're most likely looking at 256 kilobits per second for files encoded with these settings. And all that means is that every second of music will take up 256 kilobytes of space on your hard drive. There's also a spoken podcast setting, which is optimized for audio tracks that don't involve music but rather spoken word recordings. And you can see those settings use a lower bitrate. You can also choose custom if you want to take advantage of stereo bit rates as high as 320 kilobits per second. But if you're like most people, you're probably not going to be able to hear the difference between anything encoded at around, say, 192 kilobytes per second and anything higher than that. If you can hear the difference and you don't mind larger files, by all means choose a higher bitrate for your encoding. But in most cases, most people don't need to make any changes in here at all. Now the MP3 encoder is set to a default setting of high quality, which is 160 kilobits per second for a stereo recording. But most people seem to agree that even though this produces a file larger than an AAC file that's set to high quality 128 kilobits per second, the smaller AAC file will sound better. Ultimately, you're going to have to be the final judge as to which encoder and which encoder settings sound better to you. You might want to experiment with encoding one MP3 and one AAC version of the same song and see if you can tell the difference. If you can't, you might want to go with the smaller file. Now we do have a couple of other options under the Import Using menu. We have the AIFF encoder and the WAVE encoders. And these two are similar in that they don't apply any compression to the audio files. They produce very high quality sounding files that are usually several times larger than AAC or MP3 files, generally taking up about 10 megabytes of space per minute of music. So where an AAC file or an MP3 file might take up 3 to 4 megabytes for a song, an AIF or WAVE file might take up 10 megabytes. The fifth encoding option is the Apple Lossless encoder. This encoder is going to give you very close to the same quality as the AIF and WAVE encoders, but at about half the file size. So Apple lossless files are still going to be larger than AAC and MP3 files, but they'll sound better than AAC and MP3 files without taking up as much space as AIF or WAVE files. Which one of these you choose really depends on what you're going to be doing with the audio files. If you plan on burning a high-quality audio disc of the songs you're importing, you should use either the lossless encoder or the AIFF encoder for the best sounding results. Just remember that the lossless encoder takes up less space, so unless you can hear the difference between AIF and lossless, go with the lossless. Now the wave encoder would work as well too, but that's more for Windows computers that aren't using iTunes or computers that don't have MP3 playing software. So generally you don't need to use the wave encoder even if you're using Windows, since you're already using iTunes. Now if your primary purpose of importing music and audio files into your computer is just to play on the computer itself or on your iPod, or maybe to other computers on your network, you should definitely either choose MP3 or AAC as your default encoder. I suggest AAC because I think it sounds better, but if you're going to be trading files, we'll say, with other users who don't use iTunes, or maybe embedding audio files into a website you're designing, you might want to pick MP3 since AAC is not as widely supported outside of iTunes as MP3s are. So whatever setting you pick here, that's what will apply the next time you import a CD. But you can always come back here to Preferences to change your settings before you import your content too, so nothing's set in stone here. What you don't want to do is import, say, an AAC file, and then when you find out you need one of those AAC files as an MP3, convert that AAC into an MP3. Because you'll essentially be compressing an already compressed file and degrading the overall quality. You should always try to encode your files from the original source if you can. So I'm going to leave my settings at AAC encoder at the default iTunes Plus setting. Now we also have a checkbox here for use error correction when reading audio CDs. Basically, if the CD you're importing is in poor shape, maybe it's scratched up, that might introduce errors into the files you're importing. You can check this box to let iTunes take its time in importing files. It might take longer to import the songs, but it also might result in a better sounding import. So check this box if you're having trouble importing certain tracks. Finally, note that none of these settings you select here apply to songs you buy from the iTunes Store. Those tracks you purchase are already compressed and optimized by Apple, and you can't change their encoding settings. Let's click OK. Now before we wrap up this movie, I want to look at the Advanced section. And it's here where you find the default location of where your iTunes music and other media are stored. So when I copy or rip music off a CD and import it into my computer, I can see on my Mac it will go into Users, my User folder, Music, iTunes, and a folder called iTunes Music. On Windows, the default location is usually your C drive, Users, your User folder, iTunes, and iTunes Music. If I want to store my iTunes Music elsewhere, I'm free to click Change and select another location, but I generally recommend you leave the default location. A little later, I'll talk about moving your library or adding additional libraries, but for now, I just want you to be aware of where iTunes stores your files by default. You probably also want to make sure you leave Keep iTunes Media Folder Organized checked. This automatically organizes your media into artist and album folders, which can also make it easier to copy and back up your music manually. We also have an option to copy files to iTunes Media Folder when adding to library. Now this doesn't apply to music you import off a CD, which will go right into your music folder's location, but if you have audio files that maybe someone emailed you or you downloaded off the web and want to add into iTunes, with this option checked, iTunes will create a copy of that file in your iTunes music folder when you drag it in. We'll talk more about this in just a couple of movies from now. So these are the import options I wanted to show you in relation to importing music from a CD, which we'll take a look at how to do in the very next movie.